Miss Pollitt took hold of the knocker and rapped politely on the cottage door. After a discreet interval, she knocked again. The parcel under her left arm shifted a little as she did so, and she readjusted it. Inside the parcel was Mrs. Spenlow's new green winter dress, ready for fitting. From Miss Pollitt's left hand dangled a bag of black silk containing a tape measure, a pin-cushion, and a large, practical pair of scissors. Miss Pollitt was tall and gaunt, with a sharp nose, pursed lips, and meagre iron-grey hair. She hesitated before using the knocker for the third time. Glancing down the street, she saw a figure rapidly approaching. Miss Hartnell, jolly, weather-beaten, 55, shouted out in her usual loud bass voice. "Good afternoon, Miss Pollitt." The dressmaker answered. "Good afternoon, Miss Hartnell." Her voice was excessively thin and genteel in its accents. She had started life as a lady's maid. "Excuse me," she went on, "but do you happen to know if by any chance Mrs. Spenlow isn't at home?" "Not the least idea," said Miss Hartnell. "It's rather awkward, you see. I was to fit on Mrs. Spenlow's new dress this afternoon. 3:30, she said." Miss Hartnell consulted her wristwatch. "It's a little past the half-hour now." "Yes, and I have knocked 3 times. But there doesn't seem to be any answer, so I was wondering if perhaps Mrs. Spenlow might have gone out and forgotten. She doesn't forget appointments as a rule, and she wants the dress to wear the day after tomorrow." Miss Hartnell entered the gate and walked up the path to join Miss Pollitt outside the door of Laburnham Cottage. "Why doesn't Gladys answer the door?" she demanded. "Oh, no, of course, it's Thursday, Gladys's day out. I expect Mrs. Spenlow has fallen asleep. I don't expect you've made enough noise with this thing." Seizing the knocker, she executed a deafening rat-a-tat. And in addition thumped upon the panels of the door. She also called out in a stentorian voice, "What ho! Within there!" There was no response. Miss Pollitt murmured, "Oh, I think Miss Spenlow must have forgotten and gone out. I shall call some other time." She began edging away down the path. "Nonsense," said Miss Hartnell firmly. "She can't have gone out. I'd have met her. I shall just take a look through the windows and see if I can find any signs of life." She laughed in her usual hearty manner to indicate that it was a joke, and applied a perfunctory glance to the nearest window-pane. Perfunctory, because she knew quite well that the front room was seldom used, Mr. and Mrs. Spenlow preferring the small back sitting-room. Perfunctory as it was, though, it succeeded in its object. Miss Hartnell, it is true, saw no signs of life. On the contrary, she saw, through the window, Mrs. Spenlow lying on the hearthrug, dead. "Of course," said Miss Hartnell, telling the story afterwards, "I managed to keep my head. That Pollitt creature wouldn't have the least idea what to do. 'Got to keep our heads,' I said to her. 'You stay here, and I shall go for Constable Pork.' She said something about not wanting to be left, but I paid no attention at all. One has to be firm with that sort of person. I've always found they enjoy making a fuss. So I was just going off when, at the very moment, Mr. Spenlow came round the corner of the house." Here Miss Hartnell made a significant pause. It enabled her audience to ask breathlessly, "Oh, tell me, how did he look?" Miss Hartnell would then go on. "Frankly, I suspected something at once. He was far too calm. He didn't seem surprised in the least. And you may say what you like. It isn't natural for a man to hear that his wife is dead and display no emotion whatever." Everybody agreed with this statement. The police agreed with it too. So suspicious did they consider Mr. Spenlow's detachment that they lost no time in ascertaining how that gentleman was situated as a result of his wife's death. When they discovered that Mrs. Spenlow had been the moneyed partner, and that her money went to her husband under a will made soon after their marriage, they were more suspicious than ever. Miss Marple, that sweet-faced and some said vinegar-tongued elderly spinster who lived in the house next to the rectory, was interviewed very early, within half an hour of the discovery of the crime. She was approached by Police Constable Pork, importantly thumping a notebook. "If you don't mind, ma'am, I've a few questions to ask you," Miss Marple said. "In connection with the murder of Mrs. Spenlow?" Pork was startled. "May I ask, madam, how you know of it?" "The fish?" "Ah." The reply was perfectly intelligible to Constable Pork. He assumed correctly that the fishmonger's boy had brought the news, together with Miss Marple's evening meal. Miss Marple continued gently. "Lying on the floor in the sitting-room, strangled, possibly by a very narrow belt. But whatever it was taken away. How that young Fred gets to know everything. Oh, there's a pin in your tunic, Constable." Pork looked down, startled. "Oh, they do say, see a pin and pick it up, and all the day you'll have good luck." "Well, I hope it will come true. Now, what is it you want me to tell you?" Constable Pork cleared his throat importantly and consulted his notebook. "Statement was made to me by Mr. Arthur Spenlow, husband of the deceased. Mr. Spenlow says that at 2:30, as far as he can say, he was rung up by Miss Marple and asked if he would come over at 3:15, as she was anxious to consult him about something. Now, ma'am, is that true?" "Certainly not." "You did not ring up Mr. Spenlow at 2:30? "Neither at 2:30 nor any other time." "Ah." Constable Pork sucked his moustache with a great deal of satisfaction. "What else did Mr. Spenlow say?" "Mr. Spenlow's statement was that he came over here as requested, leaving his own house at 3:10. That on arrival here he was informed by the maid-servant that Miss Marple was not at home." "Oh, well, that part is true. He did come here, but I was at a meeting at the Women's Institute." "Ah." "Do tell me, Constable, do you suspect Mr. Spenlow?" "Well, it's not for me to say at this stage, but it looks to me as though somebody, naming no names, has been trying to be artful." "Mr. Spenlow." Miss Marple liked Mr. Spenlow. He was a small, spare man, stiff and conventional in speech, the acme of respectability. It seemed odd that he should have come to live in the country. He had so clearly lived in towns all his life. To Miss Marple he confided the reason. He said that he had always intended, ever since he was a small boy, to live in the country some day and have a garden of his own. He had always been very much attached to flowers. His wife, apparently, had kept a flower shop, and that is where he first met her. It was a dry statement, but it had opened up a vista of romance. A younger, prettier Mrs. Spenlow seen against a background of flowers. Mr. Spenlow, however, really knew nothing about flowers. He had no idea of seeds, of cuttings, of bedding out, of annuals or perennials. He had only a vision of a small cottage garden, thickly planted with sweet-smelling, brightly coloured blossoms. He had asked, almost pathetically, for instructions, and had noted down Miss Marple's replies to questions in a little book. He was a man of quiet method. It was perhaps because of this trait that the police were interested in him when his wife was found murdered. With patience and perseverance they learned a good deal about the late Mrs. Spenlow, and soon all St. Mary Mead knew it too. The late Mrs. Spenlow had begun life as a between-maid in a large house. She had left that position to marry the second gardener, and with him had started a flower shop in London. The shop had prospered. Not so the gardener, who before long had sickened and died. His widow carried on the shop and enlarged it in an ambitious way. She had continued to prosper. Then she had sold the business at a handsome price and embarked upon matrimony for the second time with Mr. Spenlow, a middle-aged jeweller who had inherited a small and struggling business. Not long afterwards they had sold the business and come down to St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Spenlow was a well-to-do woman. The profits from her florist's establishment had been invested, under spirit guidance, as she explained to all and sundry, for the spirits had advised her with unexpected acumen. All her investments had prospered, some in quite a sensational fashion. Instead, however, of this increasing her belief in spiritualism, Mrs. Spenlow basely deserted mediums and sittings and made a brief but whole-hearted plunge into an obscure religion of Indian affinities, which was based on various forms of deep breathing. When, however, she arrived at St. Mary Mead, she had relapsed into a period of orthodox Church of England beliefs. She was a good deal at the vicarage, and attended church services with assiduity. She patronised the village shops, took an interest in the local happenings, and played village bridge. A humdrum, everyday life. And then, suddenly, murder. Colonel Melchett, the chief constable, had summoned Inspector Slack. Slack was a positive type of man. When he made up his mind, he was sure. He was quite sure now. "Husband did it, sir," he said. "You think so?" "Quite sure of it. You've only got to look at him. Guilty as hell. Never showed a sign of grief or emotion. He came back to the house knowing she was dead. Wouldn't he at least have tried to act the part of a distracted husband? Not him, sir. Too pleased with himself. Some gentlemen can't act. Too stiff." "Any other woman in his life?" Colonel Melchett asked. "Haven't been able to find any trace of one," said Slack. "Of course he's the artful kind, and he'll cover his tracks. As I see it, he was just fed up with his wife. She'd got the money, and I should say she was a trying woman to live with, always taking up some ism or other. He cold-bloodedly decided to do away with her and live comfortably on his own. Made his plans careful, pretended to get a phone call. Melchett interrupted him. No call being traced? No, sir. That means either that he lied, or that the call was put through from a public telephone booth. The only two public phones in the village are at the station and the post office. Post office it certainly wasn't. Mrs. Blade sees everyone who comes in. Station it might be. Train arrives at 2:27. There's a bit of a bustle. But the main thing is he says it was Miss Marple who called him, and that certainly isn't true. The call didn't come from her house, and she herself was away at the Institute. You're not overlooking the possibility that the husband was deliberately got out of the way by someone who wanted to murder Mrs. Spenlow. You're thinking of young Ted Gerard, aren't you, sir? Said Slack. I've been working on him. What we're up against there is a lack of motive. He doesn't stand to gain anything, though he is an undesirable character. Quite a pretty little spot of embezzlement to his credit. Still, he did go to his boss and own up to that embezzlement, and his employers weren't wise to it. So, no motive. You have a sceptical mind, Slack, said Colonel Melchett. By the way, have you talked to Miss Marple at all? What's she got to do with it, sir? Oh, nothing, but she hears things, you know. Why don't you go and have a chat with her? She's a very sharp old lady. Slack changed the subject. One thing I've been meaning to ask you, sir. That domestic service job where the deceased started her career, Sir Robert Abercrombie's place. That's where the jewel robbery was, emeralds. Never got them back. I've been looking it up. Must have happened when the Spenlow woman was there, though she'd have been quite a girl at the time. Don't think she was mixed up in it, do you, sir? Spenlow, you know, was one of those little tuppenny-halfpenny jewellers. Just the chap for offence. But Melchett shook his head. Don't think there's anything in that. She didn't even know Spenlow at the time. I remember the case. The opinion was that a son of the house was mixed up in it, Jim Abercrombie. Awful young waster, pile of debts. Just after the robbery they were all paid off. Some rich woman, he said, but I don't know. Old Abercrombie hedged a bit about the case, tried to call the police off. Just an idea, sir, said Slack. Miss Marple received Inspector Slack with gratification, especially when she heard that he had been sent by Colonel Melchett. Oh, now, really, that's very kind of Colonel Melchett. I didn't know he remembered me. He remembers you all right. Told me that what you didn't know of what goes on in St. Mary Mead isn't worth knowing. Oh, too kind of him, I'm sure. Really, I don't know anything at all. About the murder, I mean. You know what the talk about it is? Oh, of course. But I mean, that wouldn't do, would it? To repeat idle talk. Well, this isn't an official conversation, you know. It's in confidence, so to speak. Oh, you mean you really want to know what people are saying? Whether there's any truth in it or not? Oh, that's the idea, Miss Marple. Well, of course, there's been a great deal of talk and speculation, and there really are two distinct camps, if you understand me. To begin with, there are people who think that the husband did it. A husband or a wife is, in a way, the natural person to suspect. Don't you think so? Maybe. Such close quarters, you know. Then so often the money angle. I hear that it was Mrs. Spenlow who had the money, and therefore Mr. Spenlow does benefit by her death. In this wicked world, I'm afraid, most uncharitable assumptions are made, and are often justified. He comes into a tidy sum, all right. Just so. Just so. It would seem quite possible, wouldn't it, for him to strangle her, leave the house by the back, come across the fields to my house, ask for me, pretend he'd had a telephone call from me, then go back and find his wife murdered in his absence, hoping, of course, that the crime would be put down to some tramp or burglar. What with the money angle? And if they'd been on bad terms lately, said Slack. But Miss Marple interrupted. Oh, but they hadn't. You know for a fact? Everyone would have known if they'd quarrelled. The maid, Gladys Brent, she'd have soon spread it around the village. She might not have known. Ted Gerard, good-looking young man. I'm afraid, you know, that good looks are inclined to influence one more than they should. Our last cured but one, quite a magical effect. All the girls came to church, evening service as well as morning. Many older women became unusually active in parish work. And the slippers and scarves that were made for him, quite embarrassing for a poor young man. But let me see, where was I? Oh, yes, this young man, Ted Gerard. Of course there has been talk about him. He's come down to see her very often. Though Mrs. Spenlow told me herself that he was a member of what I think they call the Oxford Group, a religious movement. They're quite sincere, very earnest, I believe, and Mrs. Spenlow was impressed by it all. And I'm sure there was no reason to believe that there was anything more in it than that. But you know what people are. Quite a lot of people are convinced that Mrs. Spenlow was infatuated with the young man, and that she'd lent him quite a lot of money. And it's perfectly true that he was actually seen at the station that day, in the train, 2:27 down train. But of course it would have been quite easy, wouldn't it, to slip out of the other side of the train and go through the cutting and over the fence and round by the hedge and never come out of the station entrance at all. And of course people do think that what Mrs. Spenlow was wearing was rather peculiar. Peculiar? A kimono, Inspector Slack, not a dress. That sort of thing, you know, is perhaps rather suggestive to some people. Is it suggestive? Oh, I don't think so. I think it was perfectly natural. You think it was natural? Under the circumstances, yes. Miss Marple's glance was cool and reflective. Inspector Slack said, "It might give us another motive for the husband. Jealousy?" "Oh, no, Mr. Spenlow would never be jealous. He's not that sort of man, not the sort who notices things. If his wife had gone away and left a note on the pincushion, it would be the first he would know anything of the kind." Inspector Slack was puzzled by the intent way she was suddenly looking at him. He had an idea that all her conversation was intended to hint at something that he didn't understand. She said now, with some emphasis, "Didn't you find any clues, Inspector, on the spot?" "People don't leave fingerprints on cigarette ash nowadays, Miss Marple." "But this, I think, was an old-fashioned crime." "What's that supposed to mean?" "Well, I think you know that Constable Pork might be able to help you, for he was the first person on the scene of the crime, as they say." Mr. Spenlow was sitting in a deck chair. He looked bewildered. he said in his thin, precise voice. I may, of course, be imagining what occurred. My hearing is not as good as it was, but I distinctly thought I heard a small boy call after me, "Ya, who's a crippin'?" It conveyed the impression to me that he was of the opinion that I had killed my dear wife. Miss Marple, gently snipping off a dead rose head, said, "That was the impression he meant to convey, no doubt. But what could possibly have put such an idea into a child's head?" "Well, listening, no doubt, to the opinions of his elders." You really mean some people think that too?" "Quite half the people in St. Mary Mead." "But, my dear lady, what can possibly have given rise to such an idea? I was sincerely attached to my wife. She did not, alas, take to living in the country as much as I had hoped she would, but perfect agreement on every subject is impossible. I assure you I feel her loss very keenly." "Probably. But if you will excuse me saying so, you do not sound as though you do." Mr. Spenlow drew his meagre frame up to its full height. "My dear lady, many years ago I read of a certain Chinese philosopher who, when his dearly loved wife was taken from him, continued calmly to beat a gong in the street, a customary Chinese pastime, I presume, exactly as usual, and the people of the city were much impressed by his fortitude." "Yes, well, the people of St. Mary Mead react rather differently. Chinese philosophy does not appeal to them. But you understand. Oh, my Uncle Henry, he was a man of unusual self-control. His motto was never display emotion. He, too, was very fond of flowers." "I was thinking," said Mr. Spenlow, with something like eagerness, "that I might perhaps have a pergola on the west side of the cottage, pink roses, and perhaps wisteria. And there is a white starry flower whose name for the moment escapes me, that—" In the tone in which she spoke to her grandnephew, aged 3, Miss Marple said, "I have a very nice catalogue here, with pictures. Perhaps you'd like to look through it. I have to go to the village." Leaving Mr. Spenlow sitting happily in the garden with his catalogue, Miss Marple went up to her room, hastily rolled up a dress in a piece of brown paper, and, leaving the house, walked briskly up to the post office. Miss Pollitt, the dressmaker, lived in the room above the post office, but Miss Marple did not go at once through the door and up the stairs. It was just 2:30, and, a minute late, the March Benham bus drew up outside the post office door. It was one of the events of the day in St. Mary Mead. The postmistress hurried out with parcels connected with the shop side of her business, for the post office also dwelt in sweets, cheap books, children's toys. And for some 4 minutes Miss Marple was alone in the post office, and not till the postmistress returned did Miss Marple go upstairs and explain to Miss Pollitt that she wanted her old grey crape altered and made more fashionable, if that were possible. Miss Pollitt promised to see what she could do. The chief constable was rather astonished when Miss Marple's name was brought to him. She came in with many apologies. "Oh, so sorry, so very sorry to disturb you. You're so busy, I know, but then you've always been so very kind, Colonel Melchett, and I felt that I would rather come to you instead of Inspector Slack, for one thing, you know, I should hate Constable Pork to get into trouble. I mean, strictly speaking, I suppose he shouldn't have touched anything at all." Colonel Melchett was slightly bewildered. "Pork? That's the St. Mary Mead constable, isn't it? What's he been doing?" "Oh, well, he picked up a pin, you know. It was in his tunic. It occurred to me at the time that it was quite probable he'd actually picked it up in Mrs. Spenlow's house." "Oh, quite. But after all, you know, I mean, what's a pin? Matter of fact, he did pick up the pin just by Mrs. Spenlow's body. He came and told Slack about it yesterday. You put him up to that, I gather. Oughtn't to have touched it, of course, but, as I say, what's a pin? It was only a common pin, the sort of thing any woman might use. Oh, no, Colonel Melchett, that's where you're wrong. Oh, to a man's eye, perhaps it looked like an ordinary pin, but it wasn't. It was a special pin, a very thin pin, the kind you buy by the box, the kind mostly used by dressmakers. Melchett stared at her, a faint light of comprehension breaking in on him. Miss Marple nodded her head several times eagerly. Yes, of course, it seems to me so obvious. She was in her kimono because she was going to try on her new dress, and she went into the front room, and Miss Pollitt just said something about measurements and put the tape measure round her neck, and then all she would have to do is cross it and pull, quite easy, so I've heard. And then, of course, she would go outside and pull the door to, and stand there knocking as though she'd just arrived. But you see, the pin shows she had already been in the house. And it was Miss Pollitt who telephoned Spenlow? Yes, from the post office at 2:30, just when the bus comes and the post office is empty. But, my dear Miss Marple, why? In heaven's name, why? You can't have a murder without a motive. Well, I think you know, Colonel Melchett, from all I've heard, this crime dates from a long time back. It reminds me, you know, of my two cousins, Anthony and Gordon. Whatever Anthony did always went right for him, and with poor Gordon it was just the other way around. Race-horses went lame, stocks went down, property depreciated. As I see it, these two women were in it together. In what? Oh, the robbery, long ago. Very valuable emeralds, I'm told. The lady's maid and the tweenie, because one thing hasn't been explained, you see. How, when the tweenie married the gardener, did they have enough money to set up a flower shop? Well, the answer is, it was her share of the swag, I think is the right expression. Everything she did turned out well. Money made money. But the other one, the lady's maid, she must have been unlucky. She came down to being just a village dressmaker. Then they met again. Quite all right at first, I expect, until Ted Gerard came on the scene. Mrs. Spenlow, you see, was already suffering from conscience, was inclined to be emotionally religious. This young man no doubt urged her to face up and come clean, and, well, I dare say she was strung up enough to do it. But Miss Pollitt didn't see it that way. All she saw was that she might go to prison for a robbery she'd committed years ago. So she made up her mind to put a stop to it all. And I'm afraid, you know, that she was always rather a wicked woman, because I don't believe she would have turned a hair if that nice, stupid Mr. Spenlow had been hanged. Colonel Melchett said slowly, "Well, we can verify your theory to a point. The identity of a Pollitt woman with the lady's maid at the Abercrombies. But Miss Marple reassured him. Oh, it will all be quite easy. She's the kind of woman who will break down at once when she is taxed with the truth. And then, you see, well, I've got her tape measure. I abstracted it yesterday when I was trying on. When she misses it and thinks the police have got it, well, she is quite an ignorant woman, and she will think that it will prove the case against her in some way." She smiled at him encouragingly. "Oh, you'll have no trouble, I can assure you." It was the tone in which his favourite aunt had once assured him that he could not fail to pass the entrance examination into Sandhurst. And he had passed.